in this video we'll be looking at nerves, and we'll be looking at their structure, their functions, and just everything about them. And to be honest, this is probably one of my favorite topics as well, just because it is so interesting to see how everything comes together. So in the human body, we've got around 7 trillion nerve cells, also known as neurons. Now, there is a wide range in length of these neurons, but the longest one that we have, just for interest's sake, is the sciatic nerve. And on this diagram on the right-hand side, the sciatic nerve starts in your lower back and it travels all the way down your leg and it ends in the heel of your foot. Now, one of the common things is sciatic nerve pain, or if you have got pain, it starts to resonate from your buttocks and it goes down all the way down your leg. And that's sometimes if the nerve gets pinched by something weird, a movement that you've done during exercise. So nerves use electrochemical messages to communicate. So electro meaning electrical, so the impulses that are generated, and then chemical has to do with the synapses where they use neurotransmitters, some chemical compounds, but we'll look at that a bit later on. Now, I've added this picture here on the side, and this is actually from the Body Worlds exhibition. Now, it is a bit graphic, so I've put a description, in the description tab, I've put a link to their website, and you can just go Google some images as well of the Body Worlds exhibition. It is graphic because it is real people that have donated their bodies, and then they get they go through the whole process of plastination, and then their bodies are posed in different positions. But this one actually is quite interesting because it shows the nervous system of the human body. So you can just see how delicate and how vast the structure is in the human body. So if you want to go have a look at that, that's also something nice to see, but I do warn you guys of the graphic content because I know some of you are quite sensitive to stuff like that. Another cool thing that you can go check out is the movie 127 Hours. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It's with James Franco. Well, it's actually just one portion of the movie that is quite interesting. It's also, once again, very graphic. So if you go look for the specific clip on YouTube, you can just search something like 127 hours arm cut. But it is, like I said, very graphic. He actually has to cut off his arm. So he's a hiker that he went out, so nobody knows where he is. He didn't tell anybody where he was going, and then he ends up in this like crevice area, and a boulder actually falls on his hand, and the only way he can get out is by amputating his own arm, and that he does using a very blunt pocket knife. So you can just already imagine what's happening there. But in the one portion of this clip, he actually has to cut through a nerve, and you can just feel every bit of the pain that he is going through. So if you want to have a look at that and you've got the stomach for it, go ahead. Now, looking at the functions of sensory and motor neurons. So firstly, let's look at the definition. So a sensory neuron conducts impulses from receptors to the central nervous system. So the receptors are now different parts of your body that will be receiving that stimulus. So for example, on your hand, you will have a receptor that picks up that stimulus and converts it into an impulse that will be then sent to the central nervous system. And then with the motor neuron, it conducts impulses away from the central nervous system to the effectors. Now, just looking at the definition of an effector, I think it's on this side. Okay, here it is. So an effector is an organ or cell that acts in response to a stimulus. So that will now be, for example, the muscle of the arm reacting to that stimulus. So let's just quickly, when something is conducts impulses from the receptors to the central nervous system, using this picture on the right hand side. So let's say somebody touches a hot stove plate. That impulse then gets sent through your sensory neurons to your central nervous system, where that information is then processed. Now, so it's taking it to the central nervous system. With the motor neuron, that conducts impulses away from the central nervous system and takes it back to the effector organ. So away and to. Very important to know the difference between the two. Now, with sensory neurons and motor neurons, they do have two other names. It doesn't matter which one you use. I'll know the difference between the two, obviously. I just think it's better for you to use sensory and motor because those two names are very similar to each other. So sensory neuron is also known as an afferent neuron. And I remember that by looking at the A and connecting it with the word arrive, because the sensory neuron transmits impulses to the brain. So it's arriving at the brain. Where with a motor neuron, it is known as an efferent neuron. And efferent, I connect the E with the word exit. So it leaves the brain and goes to the effectors. So those are the two other names that you can use. Now, looking at the structure of these two neurons, you only need to know about dendrites, the cytoplasm, the nucleus, the cell body, the axon, and the myelin sheath. Now, this specific diagram is from the Answer Series book. It's in part 1. The nervous system is in part 1, or responding to the environment, and this one is on page 1.28 if you want to have a look. So according to your exam guidelines, you only need to know the ones in red and their functions as well. So you can already see that a motor neuron and a sensory neuron have quite a different structure about them. The motor neuron is also known as a multipolar neuron, and the sensory neuron is known as a unipolar neuron. Now, what does that mean? Looking at this diagram, you can see that the motor neuron at the top has quite a few of these branches coming out of it, and those branches are called dendrites. So having multiple of those outgrowths or a large amount of these dendrites is what classifies it as a multipolar neuron. Looking at the sensory neuron, also known as a unipolar neuron, it only has one outgrowth, and that is the cell body over here. So that's the only outgrowth it has. It doesn't have multiple outgrowths like this cell body of the motor neuron. Okay, so let's quickly look at how impulses get transferred through this. So an impulse will enter the neuron through the dendrites. That's the entry point. It will then go through the cell body, information gets processed, and then that impulse is sent down this way through a structure known as the axon. So the axon then transports that information, and then it will exit this neuron through something called a terminal branch of the axon. So that is the end of this neuron. And then you'll have another neuron or multiple neurons sitting at the end of this terminal branch, and then that impulse will jump to this one through an area called the synaptic gap, or over it, and we'll look at that now. And then it gets sent down, the same process, and so it carries on. Now these neurons don't touch each other. There is a gap, that's why I'm talking about a synaptic gap, but before we get there, let's just look at some of the other structures. Now also, with a sensory neuron, same thing, impulse enters through the dendrites, travels through the axon, through the cell body, and then exits through the terminal branches of the axon. So the cell body is this massive area here, and that area over there, and in the cell body you'll find the cytoplasm and the nucleus. We've already discussed the dendrites and the axon. Then the myelin sheath is the structure around the axon. We'll look at the function now. So let's quickly, and then there's another neuron, it's called an interneuron, and we'll look specifically at this one when we look at something called a reflex arc. You don't need to know this specific neuron as well as the motor or the sensory neuron, but you do need to know the purpose of it when we get to the reflex arc. Looking at the structures and then the functions of these parts, the cell body, it consists of the cytoplasm with a nucleus. The nucleus, what does it do? It controls all the cell's functions. Then the myelin sheath, which is that area at the top here, it surrounds and insulates the axons of a neuron in order to accelerate the transmission of an impulse. So it just makes that impulse move faster through the axon. Then the axon, which is this long structure, this branch going down from the cell body in the motor neuron, and same on this side. So what does the axon do? It conducts nerve impulses away from the cell body. And then the dendrites, which are these branch-like structures at the top, they are there to conduct nerve impulses to the cell body. Next, we'll look at the reflex arc. So here you need to know the definition of a reflex action and then a reflex arc. Then you need to know the different structures and then their functions of each part, and then explaining that by looking at a diagram and using these words. So this is in your exam guidelines, so if you just want to go have a look at that a bit later on, that would be good. You also need to know the functioning of a simple reflex action using an example, the significance of a reflex action, and then the significance of synapses. Looking at the definition of a reflex arc and a reflex action. So a reflex arc is a pathway along which an impulse travels from a receptor to an effector to bring about a reflex action. So it's basically, the reflex arc is just the pathway that is followed. Then the reflex action is a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. This is to minimize any harmful conditions to the body. An example is when you have a hot stove or you prick your finger on a needle, and then the body's response in removing that body part to minimize the harmful effects on the body. That also brings us to the significance of a reflex action. So it protects the body from further injury, because you've already touched the hot stove and you've already pricked your finger. So there's already injury, but it prevents further injury from you burning your hand further or damaging your finger further. So it is a quick reaction from the spinal cord and not the brain. And this is not to overload the brain. So this reaction is from the spinal cord. So let's look at this practically, this reflex arc. So the definition for arc is moving with a curving trajectory. Okay, so basically, once we do this reflex arc route now, you will see the curvature that happens. So when you describe the reflex arc, you need to be using certain words like they mentioned in the exam guideline. So we're going to be talking about a stimulus, we're going to be talking about an impulse, the different neurons, we're going to be talking about the spinal cord, where it enters the spinal cord, the synaptic gap, and then the motor neuron, where it exits, and then when it goes to the effectors. So we'll look at that in detail when we study this diagram now. So they've asked this in quite a few exams, generally something with an open flame, or there's even a needle involved, and then they also sometimes ask this a knee example. So how do you interpret this? So firstly, there'll be a receptor, in this case it's the finger. that receives a stimulus. Now this stimulus is the heat from the flame. That stimulus is then converted into an impulse. Now that impulse will then travel through the sensory neuron towards your spinal cord. So that impulse then travels through your sensory neuron towards your spinal cord. When it gets to the spinal cord, there are two entryways, or entry and an exit. So the first one is the dorsal root of the spinal cord. So that is where the sensory neuron enters. And then it will exit through the ventral root. So dorsal means top and ventral means bottom. So this stimulus now travels through your sensory neurons as an impulse towards the spinal cord. That impulse then enters your spinal cord through the dorsal root, and then there's going to be a transfer of this impulse between different neurons. So now we are currently with the sensory neuron, but now it is going to go through this neuron here, which is a interneuron. It is known as the interneuron, and going back to this diagram at the bottom, it's this one over here. So an interneuron just serves as basically a bridge between the motor and the sensory neuron so that there can be a transfer of impulses. So it passes the synaptic gap, so between the neurons. So let's say this is the terminal branch of the sensory neuron, then there's going to be a gap between the sensory neuron and, let's say, the interneuron's dendrite. So they're not touching each other, but that impulse has to pass through that gap in order to get to the next neuron, which is the interneuron. So it passes the synaptic gap, it enters the interneuron, then it's going to exit the interneuron by passing the next synaptic gap. So let's say the interneuron also has the terminal branches, and then the motor neuron is the next neuron that it's going to enter through. Not my best drawing. So now it has to pass that synaptic gap there as well. As soon as it passes it, it enters the motor neuron. So it's now in this area here. Now the motor neuron is going to exit the spinal cord through the ventral root of the spinal cord. So this bottom exit. And then it's going to travel, that impulse is going to travel down the motor neuron and towards the effector. And what it's going to tell the effector organ in this case, which is a muscle, it's going to tell it to contract and withdraw the part being stimulated. So then you're going to have that upwards jerk of the hand. Now remember, this happens within split seconds, all these impulses traveling up and down. And that is for you, this is an involuntary reaction, so you're not thinking about it, your body just does it on its own. So what do you need to know here? You need to know the route that is followed by the reflex arc, and I hope you can see the arc now. So let me find a different color. So this section here is the reflex arc. That information is coming in, and then it's making almost like a U-turn and coming back. So moving with a curving trajectory, and it's going back to the effector. Like I said, they like asking this knee example as well. Sometimes they'll even ask you what happens if the sensory neuron is not allowing the impulse to travel through, or even the motor neuron, but we'll look at that when we do some examples of old exam questions. So once again, there's a stimulus. That stimulus is the hammer of the doctor hitting a certain spot on the knee to check your reflex actions. That stimulus is then converted into an impulse that travels through your sensory neuron and enters your spinal cord through the dorsal root. It then passes the synaptic gap and enters the interneuron, and that impulse travels through the interneuron, passes another synaptic gap, and then goes into the motor neuron, because now we've got a message of what has to happen. There's another impulse that will tell your foot what to do. Travels through the motor neuron, exits the spinal cord through the ventral root, travels down and to the effector muscles in this case, which is your quads and your hamstrings, and then that impulse tells your foot to move, or your leg in that matter, for that matter, to move up or down. So now the synapse and its significance. It is a small gap between neurons, known as the synaptic gap. These neurons, these three types of neurons, sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron, they don't come into contact with each other. They don't touch each other. Looking at this in a more zoomed in version, so looking at that area over there, we've got the terminal branch of one neuron coming close to the dendrite of the next. So this is the terminal branch, and then this is the dendrite of the next one. That little area over there is known as the synaptic cleft or the synaptic gap, and it's through that gap that the impulse has to travel in order to get to the next neuron. So what is the significance of a synapse? So it allows impulses to travel between neurons, so for that impulse to go from the sensory neuron into the interneuron, and from there into the motor neuron. And then it allows the impulses to pass from the terminal branch of one neuron to the dendrite of the next. We've talked about that already. And then it allows impulses to travel in only one direction. We only want an impulse to go in one specific direction, because if it goes back, there's going to be a major glitch and your body is going to start malfunctioning. It also allows multiple nerves to join and split. So at this terminal branch of this motor neuron, you could have the dendrites of a next motor neuron coming in, and even one over there and another over here. And then it also ensures that there aren't an overload of stimuli that is felt. So when we look at that, if you get dressed in the morning, for example, you are going to feel your clothes being put on. But after that, you don't really pay much more attention to the feeling of your clothes on your body, and that is because of the synaptic gap, or the synapses that basically cut out that stimulus in order for your body not to overload your brain with too many messages coming in or out. So that is what helps you. And until you start thinking about your clothes on your body, then you will start perceiving that sensation again, but otherwise that is cut out completely. Now, looking at how this impulse will travel from the one neuron to the next, that is done with some chemicals known as neurotransmitters. And this is dopamine, for example, is one, and then serotonin is the other. So these chemicals, there are others, but these are some of the better known ones. So these chemicals take that impulse and they carry it over that gap to the next dendrite. Now, as soon as they reach the other side, there are enzymes that are ready and waiting. As soon as those neurotransmitters reach the side, those enzymes basically break down those neurotransmitters so that they are not able to carry the impulse back. And this is what happens with people that have Parkinson's, for example. They don't produce those enzymes anymore, so those neurotransmitters don't get destroyed, which means that impulse is going back and forth the whole time, which causes those people to have quite a lot of jitters. I think that is all that I wanted to say with regards to that, and I actually have a micrograph here, 2 micrographs of neurons. So it's a picture taken through a microscope of a neuron. So this is the cell body, the nucleus, and you can see there's multiple cell bodies next to each other. So allowing, that's what the synapses are for, so it allows multiple nerves to join or split, as you can see in this picture over here. Now, just for interest's sake, your brain has 86 billion neurons in it. Now, that is quite a large amount, and researchers have previously thought that it was close to 100 billion, but the most recent information that we have is that it is close to 86 billion. And it's quite interesting how they got to that conclusion, and I've placed an article, a link of that article in the description tab, so if you guys want to have a look at that just for some extra reading, that would be nice. And that is the end of this video.